Welcome to your 20-minute podcast with David Brower, brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/your 20-minute podcast. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Now, here's your host, David Brower.
Thanks, Alan. This is David Brower with your 20-minute podcast. Our special guest today is Rob Greenlee, and he is a pioneer, one of the very first, if not the first, to do podcasts back in September 15th, 2004. And he's chatting with us live from, or not live as you listen to it, but from Seattle, Washington. Rob, thanks a lot for joining us. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, David. Thanks for the invite. And I always love talking about podcasting and the path that I was on, in the early days, as well as I love talking about what's going on today too. So
absolutely,
great to be on. Yeah,
thank you so much. So tell me about September 15th, 2004. What precipitated the idea of doing a podcast?
Well, it was something that I was really kind of involved in for many years prior to the development of podcasting. I was doing a radio show at the time in a radio station, and had brought that actually home and built my own studio and was making my Web Talk World radio show available as a download off my website for many years prior to that. And most of my listenership was coming from streaming at the time, because back in those days, back in the early 2000s, bandwidth was not as plentiful as it is today.
True.
People were still on dial-up connections, and so I was streaming my audio program 16K or 32K back in those days. So I didn't.
Oh my gosh!
I didn't saturate the connections that a listener would have to the internet. So
right.
So it was, back in those days. I mean, it was making my show available as an MP3 download, and what was great about that was that people could kind of set that download to just download over a period of time. They weren't necessarily listening, so it was. Get the audio file and then listen to it later was the model.
Okay.
And so that was kind of how I got involved in this, and was creating kind of longer shows, but it was also taking segments out of my radio show and embedding them into written articles too. So I was playing around with kind of the combining of content online in those days, because text was delivered a little quicker, and
sure.
And if I could just present a link in there to play a short soundbite or something that supported the textual side of it, then that was something that helped me drive people to listen to the radio show that was syndicated across the country.
You had to be one of the first people ever to combine audio with print back in those days, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was not a common practice back then.
Right,
that's for sure. I think some of the online journalists back then, with some of the larger newspapers and magazines that were putting content online, were starting to get involved in trying to link up some audio. But back in those days, the audio process was very cumbersome. It was complicated. It was very geeky and difficult to understand.
Yeah.
And the tools were not really very clear. It was very rudimentary. I had my own. I was fortunate. I built my own servers in a co-location facility, and I had the ability to have a real server and a Windows Media streaming server and all that kind of stuff. And I was able to tap into that stuff.
Wow.
Very early in the growth of this medium. So I was able to offer things that weren't commonly offered by a lot of people back then.
Absolutely.
But that was kind of the heyday of the development of the streaming side of media delivery. So, yeah.
I was in radio for a very long time, and that stuff I got out of it in 2001, so that stuff wasn't even on my radar. So it's been fascinating for me to watch the growth, which has been like lightning speed, I'm sure, for you in the last several years, right?
Well, it's been growing. The podcasting business and the podcasting listenership base has been growing at a consistent clip. It's not been a rocket ship ride by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at the research that's being done around media consumption of on-demand podcasting today, it's growing at between 2 and 4% a year. That's been the pattern since about 2004 or 5, when the Edison Research folks started to do survey studies on the consumption of podcasts. Right. So there is a perception that there was a gap in popularity of podcasting, like in the middle part of the last decade. like in the 2008 timeframe or so. 2009, there was a little bit of a dip in press coverage. Really, it was more around the hype. That was about the time when YouTube and Twitter and Facebook were starting to hit their stride.
Sure.
And so the attention of the media was definitely attracted over to social media in that 2008 to 2010 timeframe. And that kind of pulled the attention away from podcasting. But podcasting continued to grow consistently every year. And then at some point, we had a spike in the consumption of this medium because of the iPhone. The iPhone really was the trigger that actually made this medium consistently grow and build its reputation as a viable medium. And that's really taken us to today with quality content starting to really come into the medium, and that's just propelled it forward as more people have been attracted to listen to on-demand podcasting content because it's getting better.
Well, that's right. I think as myself as a relative novice compared to what you've been doing with this, I just started thinking about podcasts maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and then the more I looked into it, the more I thought about getting serious about doing one. My perception was, holy crap, these things are everywhere, And then I started paying attention to what people were doing and how they were finding their niche, or as they say today, niche, and marketing it and doing all those kinds of things. And it just became fascinating to me. And I'm going, well, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah.
And so I've been having a blast doing it.
Well, and it's still early too. I mean, the research is showing is that only about half of the U.S. population has ever listened to an on-demand audio program or a podcast. So we're still not reaching the majority of the U.S. population. It's like sitting at like 50% right now have listened to a podcast ever. So
wow,
we still have a lot of upside to this. And you think about radio. Radio is still a dominant audio delivery platform.
Sure.
Radio is starting to lose its luster and lose its steam a little bit, but they're still capturing 90% of the U.S. population.
No, that's right.
On a regular basis. So radio is here. Radio is under threat, but radio is still here. That's kind of what I call it.
And satellite didn't, by any means, satellite radio certainly didn't hurt traditional radio as much as people might have thought it.
So this past year, podcasting surpassed the consumption of satellite radio. So podcasting is now beyond the satellite radio consumption, which I guess if you think about it isn't really a big surprise.
Right.
I'm surprised it probably didn't happen sooner, but satellite radio still has a presence out there, but it's now been eclipsed by the on-demand piece, which as the younger generation grows up, they're taking a larger slice of the on-demand piece, and
I'll be darned.
That's where I think that the generational shift that's happening is shifting to on-demand. As you think about how those younger people consumed music,
right?
It was based on what they wanted to consume when they wanted to consume it, and that's going to come to on-demand audio too on the talk side, and that's what we're starting to see happen as those younger generations move into the prime audio consumption age group, which is in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
Typically. You're going to see this shift happen, though we're seeing trends that are starting to show themselves that the younger generation, I'm talking about the late teens to mid-20s, are starting to really pick up on their consumption of podcasting. Well, yeah, and now more and more Spotify is taking on podcast content. So we're starting to see podcast content make it into a music platform that tends to reach those younger listeners. So we're starting to see this evolution happen.
My podcast is on Spotify and iHeartRadio, and I get more downloads from iHeartRadio than I do anywhere.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Those are those next generation platforms to some degree that are becoming important to the younger consumption audience. Yeah.
I'll be darned. Do you see the growth of podcasts continuing to grow in that 2 to 4% range, or is that younger demographic going to help increase the speed of that, do you think?
Yeah, that's a complicated question as you look into the future because, I'm not seeing anything right today that's going to tell me that we're going to grow any faster over the next year or two beyond 4%. I think there's some key things that need to be overcome before we're going to see a 5 to 10% growth. And one of the key things is Android. It's one of those untapped areas of podcast consumption
Mm-hmm.
that is just sitting there ready to be reached. And it's Google has been a little slow to adopt podcasting in any kind of a first party solution.
Right.
And I'm hoping that they will, because if you look at the research numbers that shows what the consumption is of podcasts on iOS versus Android, it's like 6-to-1 or 5-to-1.
Huh.
It's a huge discrepancy. So you're only getting about 20% of the consumption of on-demand audio on Android as opposed to the consumption of on-demand audio on iOS, which is 80%.
And that's because iOS got a head start. I mean, they jumped on it before Android even thought about it.
Yeah, but there's more Android devices out there than there is iPhones. So
isn't that funny?
That's the missed opportunity, right?
Yeah.
There's about 20% of all the phones out there are iOS devices. 80% of them are Android. So
I'll be darned.
You're looking at kind of like a market opportunity that's just not being reached right now. So I'm working with Google and helping them along with their approach to this medium, and hopefully they'll come up with a much better solution over the next year or two that will open the doors to reaching hopefully a larger group of the U.S. population and actually the global population, frankly.
Good for you. So does with Google coming out with their Google phones now, the Pixel, I have the Pixel XL too, and with them developing and promoting a really good Android phone, is that going to help their mindset move towards podcasts more, or is that apples and oranges?
Well, it's really kind of a difference between a first-party kind of app that needs to be developed for Android that will really be kind of like built into the operating system, unlike what the Apple folks have done with iOS, is to expose a terrific listening experience on the Android platform that's first-party. People look for that because it's a Google-made product.
Yep.
And that's what will hopefully attract people to give podcasting a try on the Android device. Now, granted, there are applications that you can get for your Android device that support podcasting. Spotify is a growing one of them that has a significant presence on Android.
Yep.
So you can certainly go there and start consuming podcasts on that app. There's apps like Stitcher and the company that I work for called Spreaker has a listening consumption app on Android that's terrific. So it's all these third-party apps is what's available on Android today, and the problem is that a lot of those apps don't have very much market share. So so they're all just tiny slices of the opportunity on Android. And Google really needs to just get behind it. Oftentimes these big companies, I used to work for Microsoft. I ran the Zune podcasting platform for 6 years for Microsoft as part of the Xbox team and Windows Phone and stuff. So I understand the kind of big company approach to this and how they look at podcasting because I ran that platform for a big company for many years. So it's a different approach. They have to think about it differently than maybe a startup company thinks about podcasting. So it's something that you have to talk their language and you have to understand what their needs are and be able to navigate that pathway to, because oftentimes what happens, and we kind of saw that happen a little bit with Google in the past with their Google Play podcasting service that they have today. So Google does support podcasting as part of their Google Play product. It's just that it wasn't done in the way that would scale or help them in any significant way. There's still a lot of podcasts there, but it's not really available easily on mobile. It's only on the web. It's those kind of things, right? Most of the consumption of podcast is happening on mobile devices now, so it's not happening on the web as much as it used to.
So is Google, are they interested in more of the monetization of podcasts before they're interested in the technology and the exploration of it, or what's their mindset?
It's a couple of things that is important to them, and they're certainly, I wouldn't be disclosing anything too much here because it's really their core business is that they're an advertising business, right? Google makes most of their money off of advertising. And so that's obviously always in the back of their minds. But they're also interested in having a terrific discovery and listening experience as well. They do care about the experience, but they also want to be cutting edge.
Yep.
They want to look like they're innovating. So, and that's where it gets a little touchy at times because being an innovator tends to cut in two directions on you. So you have to be able to support the basic functions but not get too ahead of yourself. Because you get too ahead of yourself, you can hurt yourself because people are not expecting that, right? Or they don't understand it. Where if you come into it from an understanding of, it's about timing of the features and functions of what the audience expects.
Sure.
And it's difficult for a big company to do that, to time products that have long development lead times.
I would think so. And the other part of that, I would think, is once they find themselves being very innovative and coming out with with the next great whatever, there's got to be a balance there. Okay, now if we're gonna be this innovative and we're going to get from point A to point X, we got to throw some money behind this to let people know that it's here, and that's got to be a huge investment based on their confidence level.
Building out a platform for podcasting. It was the question that I got asked every year when I worked at Microsoft. It's like, well, why are we investing in podcasting when we don't make any money at it? Right. So, so how do we leverage it to either help some part of our business or to grow, or leverage it to grow advertising revenue, or how do we, do we sell more Android devices because we're offering this? How can we quantify this? And that's where the rubber hits the road with this stuff, and that's what's challenging. That's why Apple supports podcasting, because their core business is selling devices and creating great user experiences that will then cause people to buy more devices. That's a different model than Google has. Google has a model of selling advertising, which doesn't always create a terrific user experience. So adding to content doesn't create a better piece of content. It just creates content with advertising, which can be seen by some as a negative thing. So you've got this balance that you have to strike between advertising that's too intrusive or not intrusive enough because the advertisers want it to be intrusive because they want their message delivered. So it's really walking a fine line, and advertising and podcasting has been a very sensitive topic. It's been one of the reasons podcasting has been successful is because it has had limited advertising in it, and that the advertising that was in it was very organic, natural, kind of host endorsed, very much trust-based. And that's difficult to replicate at scale. And that's one of the challenges that this medium has to grow in its revenue and investment, is the fact that these advertising models are kind of different than I think what's built big businesses in the past.
Absolutely. Well, I thought one of the things that was fascinating in the news the last couple of days was the CEO of Apple coming out on MSNBC and being asked about the Facebook issue, and he says, well, they're in the business of advertising and making money. We're in the business of selling phones. Yeah.
So, I mean, it depends on where you're coming from, and when I was working at Microsoft, Microsoft is not strong at advertising models either. They're into selling software, and that's what's different, that made it a challenge for podcasting too, because you typically don't sell software in support of podcasting. So, where's the model for a company like Microsoft? And that's one of the reasons why they wind up shutting it down, I believe. I kind of was there, building out this platform on Windows Phone, and Windows Phone, as we all know, is kind of disappearing. So, that's not a viable platform anywhere for Microsoft these days. And so that's why podcasting kind of disappeared. It wasn't a priority for Xbox. And that was understandable too, because what are you going to do? Build that into the game console? I mean, it's something that I tried to get them to do, but it never really kind of got accepted, So, and it's understandable when I think back on it. But it's, so you have to look at the company and what their DNA is and what they focus on. And that will dictate whether or not they do something. And I think Google is sitting in a very good place to do something with podcasting. It's just they need to figure out what the heck that's going to be.
Thank you, Rob. Rob Greenlee, and you can catch him at robgreenlee.com, Rob at Spreaker.com, SpreakerLiveshow.com, Twitter. I mean, you're everywhere, man. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch you down the road fairly soon.
Your 20-minute podcast with David Brower has been brought to you by Audible. You can listen to any of David's podcasts anywhere podcasts can be found, including iHeartRadio, the Spotify mobile app, and at davidbrowervo.com/your20-minute podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.